It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in early spring. The kind of day when the sun slipped gently through lace curtains and everything felt just right. Margaret stood in her kitchen, brewing tea with the same rhythm she'd followed for Decadescent brand, same cup, same 3 minutes steeped. She had long found comfort in routine, in the small rituals that made life feel steady. Before we get started, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. Her son, Andrew, sat across from her at the table, bouncing his knee, fiddling with his phone. She thought nothing of it. Young people always had some screen lighting up their face. But then he said it, casually, almost like an afterthought. "Mom, I proposed." Taylor said yes. For a second, the world held its breath. Margaret looked up, her heart tightening not from worry, but from a surge of joy so deep it made her feel young again. Her baby boy was getting married. A wave of warmth swept over her, flooding every quiet place in her heart that had long gone unnoticed. She smiled so hard, her cheeks ached. "That's wonderful, Andrew. Oh, honey, I'm so happy for you both." As he spoke about the proposal, Margaret's mind danced ahead: flower arrangements, music, vows, candles at twilight. Weddings had once been her life. For 35 years, she had been one of the most trusted wedding planners in Boston. She'd brought magic to barns and ballrooms, crafted elegance from scratch, and made countless families feel seen and celebrated. And now, finally, it would be his wedding. Their moment. Not a client's, not someone else's child. Hers. "I already have some ideas," she said, half laughing, heart full. "Not to interfere, of course, but I'd love to help, even just a little. I still have my book of contacts." Andrew hesitated. He looked away. "Actually," he said slowly, "Taylor kind of already has a vision. She's into more modern, minimal stuff. Follows this planner on Instagram. She's thinking of hiring her." Margaret blinked. "Oh, I see. I just thought maybe I could help with a few things." And then came the words. He didn't say them himself, but repeated them, like quoting a memo passed down. "She said it'd be best if you stayed in your lane." Margaret sat very still. The teacup warmed her hands, but inside her chest, something cooled. She smiled too wide, too practiced. And in that moment, something precious quietly faded. Not her pride, but the hope that love alone would guarantee a seat at the table. Margaret showed up to the cafe with quiet hope folded into her handbag. She wore a soft peach blouse, gold earrings that caught the morning light, and a smile that had weathered decades of both joy and heartbreak. She'd been invited somewhat last minute by Taylor for a casual lunch with her mother and a few of her friends to chat wedding vibes. The invitation had been brief, vague, but Margaret saw it as a gesture. A crack in the wall, a chance to be included. In her bag, she carried a small folder. Inside were thoughtfully arranged inspiration, board-stimless color palettes, elegant floral concepts, seating plans that subtly encouraged connection. She wasn't there to take over, just to offer a piece of her experience, maybe a little memory-making magic. After all, she had once made a career out of turning moments into milestones. When she arrived, the others were already seated. Taylor barely looked up from her phone. "Hey," she mumbled before returning to her scrolling. Her mother, Diane, greeted her with a tight, fleeting smile. The friends nodded politely, well-mannered, but distant. Margaret ordered tea and waited patiently for the conversation to circle back to the wedding. When it finally did, she opened her folder gently and said, with practiced grace, "I brought a few ideas, just in case you wanted to see some options." Taylor waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, that's okay, Margaret. We're going for more of a current look. Nothing too traditional." The word traditional dropped like a stone in her chest. Taylor smiled, polished, empty. "I'm sure you've got amazing stuff, from back then." The others giggled. "We're working with a planner from LA, one friend added. "She's done these insane shoots with disco balls and neon palms." Margaret's fingers hovered at the edges of her folder. Still, calm. She closed it quietly. "I mean," Taylor continued, "we just really want this to feel like us. Not like a ballroom wedding or whatever our parents did. And then, the final cut. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. Inside were photos of Andrew's first steps, his toothless grin, the Halloween he dressed as a pumpkin. She offered them softly. I thought maybe these could be part of the slideshow. Just some moments that meant a lot. Taylor glanced down and shrugged. Cute. But they're kind of too real, you know. We're going for a more curated aesthetic. Margaret nodded, said nothing. But inside, something long-loved quietly folded. Not her dignity, but her place in the picture. Some people slam doors when they're hurt. Margaret simply let hers drift closed. After that lunch the laughter, the careful dismissal, the quiet humiliation, she still tried. She wasn't the kind of woman to retreat at the first sting. She had raised Andrew with grace, with persistence. She knew love meant showing up, even when it wasn't easy, even when it wasn't appreciated. So the following week, she sent a short email. A warm message, nothing heavy, just a handful of trusted local vendors she'd worked with for years, florists who remembered your name, caterers who cared about flavor more than trends. Only if it's helpful, she wrote. Wishing you both a joyful planning process. With love, Mom. She pressed send and waited. A day passed, then 2, then 7. No reply. Not from Taylor. Not from Andrew. Not even a thank you. It was a silence louder than any argument. Still, she gave it one more try. Margaret packed a small box of Andrew's childhood keepsakes photo albums, a handprint from kindergarten, the baseball card he'd once thought was magical. She thought perhaps Taylor might want to include them in the wedding slideshow, or maybe just see the boy behind the man. When she knocked on their apartment door, it was Taylor who answered. Her smile was smooth, practiced. "Oh, we didn't know you were coming," she said, standing in the doorway but not inviting Margaret in. "I just wanted to drop these off," Margaret replied, lifting the box. "Some keepsakes. Maybe something for the wedding." Taylor hesitated, then reached for the box without looking inside. "Thanks, but we're doing something more, digital photos from our phones, kind of casual." She paused, then added, "It's more our style." Andrew appeared a moment later. His face looked strained, like someone pulled between loyalty and discomfort. "Hey, Mom," he said, giving her a brief hug. "You didn't have to bring those in person." "I was in the neighborhood," she lied gently. "Thought I'd say hello." Taylor cleared her throat. "Actually, we're heading to a venue appointment." "Oh," Margaret said, her voice steady. "That's lovely. I hope it's everything you want it to be." She didn't mention the Elmwood estate, or the other places she once dreamed of for Andrew. She just smiled, turned away, and walked to the elevator with nothing in her hands. Because when the door closed, Margaret understood. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was a choice. And she had been quietly written out. It was supposed to be a quiet dinner. One of those gestures Margaret still clung to: handmade pot roast, linen napkins, a warm pie cooling near the window. A small attempt at connection, at tradition, at being part of something that had once felt like family. Andrew and Taylor arrived half an hour late. Taylor walked in, wrinkling her nose. "Oh, wow, it smells very intense in here," she remarked, slipping off her coat and tossing it carelessly over the arm of a chair. "I don't really eat red meat." Margaret didn't flinch. She only smiled and offered tea. She had always believed in kindness, even when it wasn't returned. Dinner was uncomfortable from the start. Margaret asked about the venue, the dress, the music. Taylor gave short, clipped answers. Andrew stayed quiet, his eyes darting between them like he was silently pleading for peace without offering any himself. It was when Margaret gently mentioned knowing a seamstress, an old friend who still made custom gowns by hand, that Taylor's smile turned sharp. "Margaret," she said, setting her teacup down a little too firmly, "I know you mean well, but I feel like you're just not hearing us. We want something modern. It's not the 90s anymore. I already have someone amazing in mind." Margaret nodded, feeling that old, familiar crack reopen in her chest. Taylor smiled again, this time with finality. "I just want everyone to stay in their lane so things go smoothly." The words hung in the air, heavier now. Not a passing suggestion, a command. The same phrase she had heard before casual then, now laced with quiet cruelty. Stay in your lane. Margaret set her fork down gently. Not in anger, in clarity. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. She cleared the dishes, packed leftovers, and kissed Andrew goodbye on the cheek. He murmured a vague thanks, already looking away. As the door closed behind them, the silence in her house felt different. Not empty but honest. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to truly feel it. She wasn't just being left out. She was being erased. And not by accident. That night, she sat at the kitchen table long after the candles had been blown out. Before her was a small, leather-bound notebook. Its pages were filled with numbers, notes, and careful savings records of a wedding fund she and her late husband had started over 2 decades ago. It was never about the money. It was about love turned into sacrifice. About 2 parents who had tucked away bits of their own joy travel plans, renovations, small luxurioso, that one day they could give their son something unforgettable. For Andrew's day, her husband had once written, "Make it count." But now? Margaret looked at the checkbook, then at the silence around her. She had tried. She had been polite, helpful, present. She had stayed soft, hoping softness would be seen. But kindness uninvited becomes compliance. And she would not fund her own disappearance. The next morning, she visited the bank. The teller was cheerful, unaware of the storm behind Margaret's calm smile. A few keystrokes, a few signatures, quiet redirection. The bulk of the wedding fund was moved into a private savings account under Margaret's name. She left just enough to keep up appearances, as she put it. No grand declarations, no vindictive speeches, just a boundary drawn in ink and resolve. Later that evening, she wrote a note. A short one, folded neatly with a small check. Dear Andrew and Taylor, as you prepare for your special day, I wanted to offer a modest contribution. I trust you'll make it beautiful and meaningful in your own way. Wishing you both joy. With love, Mom. She sealed the envelope, and with it, she sealed a chapter. Because if she wasn't welcome at the table, she would no longer bring the feast. They had asked her to stay in her lane, so she did. But they never asked where that lane might lead. There's a kind of silence that follows arrogance, the kind that arrives not with a bang, but with a long, unraveling thread. That's the silence that descended weeks after Margaret quietly withdrew the wedding fund and mailed the symbolic check. No thank you note came. No call, no response. Just the sound of distance deepening. And then, one late afternoon, while Margaret was pruning roses in her backyard, gloves dirtied, thoughts far from anything ceremonial, her phone rang. Andrew's voice trembled through the speaker. She's gone. Margaret froze, clippers still in hand. Who's gone? Savannah, the planner. She took the money, Mom, all of it. It took a moment to settle. Gone? She repeated. She wiped everything. The website, her numbers, her Instagram is deleted. Taylor's tried everything. She's not answering. She vanished. Margaret sat down slowly on the garden bench, heart steady, voice quiet. How much did you give her? A pause. 55,000. Margaret exhaled not out of shock, but out of something heavier, a knowing. They had chosen a stranger over her, a planner with 2 million followers but no verified business address. A woman whose glossy photos and curated hashtags had dazzled them into blind trust. Taylor had dismissed Margaret's decades of experience as outdated, yet handed over a fortune to a woman she had never even met. Taylor's not talking to me, Andrew whispered. She blames me, says I should have convinced you to pay, that this wouldn't have happened if you'd just used your fund. Margaret's voice remained even. That's not true. The words held no vengeance, only clarity. This happened, she continued, because both of you treated the fund and May as a guarantee, something to be assumed, not respected, a backup plan you never thought you'd actually need. He said nothing. I'm sorry, he said finally, but some damage runs deeper than an apology can reach. In the days that followed, word spread quietly. The wedding was postponed. Friends were told. But beneath the soft excuses, the truth rippled. Vendors canceled, deposits were unrecoverable, contracts were broken. Tension gave way to blame, blame to silence. And within a month, the engagement dissolved. Taylor moved back in with her mother. Andrew remained in the apartment alone. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't reach out with an "I told you so," didn't parade her foresight like a trophy. She simply stayed in her lane, just as they had asked. But from her lane, she watched. Not in triumph, but in quiet sorrow. Because sometimes, watching someone fall isn't satisfying, it's just inevitable. Taylor had wanted a spectacle, a wedding that would look flawless through a screen, one built on algorithms and aspiration. But she hadn't built a marriage. She'd curated an event. Andrew? He had chosen silence when he should have spoken. Peace at the cost of truth. And when the illusion shattered, he realized too late that not all peace is worth keeping. Margaret reflected often in that time, not out of spite, but out of wisdom. She had been left out not because she lacked value, but because her presence brought depth. And depth, to those obsessed with image, can be inconvenient. She thought of the note her husband had once written, "For Andrew's Day, make it count," and how, perhaps, it had counted in a different way than he ever imagined. What they had saved together had not been wasted. It had simply been redirected. Instead of fueling a performance, it had quietly protected Margaret from being a silent investor in her own dismissal. And now, as she walked through her house, quiet, but still warm with her presence, he felt no regret, just peace. The peace of someone who had learned that not every silence is a loss. Some are boundaries, some are victories. And this silence? This was the sound of dignity. Because when people build towers on ego and exclusion, they forget one storm is enough. And sometimes, the storm is simply the absence of the one who used to hold the foundation steady. Margaret didn't celebrate the collapse. She didn't call Andrew. She didn't comment on the headlines or whisper to mutual friends. She didn't seek an apology or explanation. When the news broke of the vanished planner, the canceled wedding, the fractured relationship, she simply remained still. Not out of indifference, but out of choice. Because this was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming her dignity. Instead of watching the fallout unfold, Margaret returned to herself. She rose early and worked in the garden, hands deep in soil, coaxing life from places others might overlook. She started attending a ceramics class at the community center, not to master anything, just to feel the joy of shaping something new. Her bowls came out lopsided, her glazes uneven, but her laughter was the most confident thing in the room. She accepted invitations for coffee, reconnected with old friends, joined a weekly poetry reading at the library. She even hosted a brunch for a few retired wedding vendors she hadn't seen in years. There were no centerpieces or seating charts, just laughter, shared memories, and a quiet understanding between women who knew how to hold space for others and were finally learning to hold space for themselves. And most of all, she began writing again. Not checklists, not schedules, but stories. She pulled out her old wedding journals, the ones filled with sketches, timelines, love letters from brides, and began transcribing moments that had once passed too quickly. She started a memoir, The Quiet Thread, Stories Behind the Veil, not to seek praise, not to prove she was still relevant, but because she finally understood something crucial. Her worth had never come from how many people applauded her. It had come from the way she showed up, quietly, constantly, with grace. And now, she was showing up for herself. She no longer needed to be the one who saved the day or smoothed the conflict. She no longer chased inclusion. She simply chose herself, and in doing so, discovered a peace more enduring than any apology could offer. While Andrew and Taylor were still untangling the wreckage of their choices, Margaret was already growing something new. Not a garden party or a grand event, but a life-rooted, resilient, and rich with meaning. Because some victories don't look like winning. They look like choosing not to fight, and walking away with your head held high. Time has a quiet way of humbling even the most stubborn hearts. After the chaos faded, after the wedding was called off, and Taylor returned to her mother's house, Andrew disappeared into silence. Not out of anger, not even out of shame, but out of confusion, grief, and a kind of aching emptiness he hadn't anticipated. For weeks, Margaret heard nothing. But then one afternoon, as she was pruning the last of the summer roses, she saw him, standing at the gate like a boy who wasn't sure if he'd still be welcomed home. The lines on his face looked deeper, his voice quieter. "Hi, Mom," he said. She didn't speak right away, just met his eyes. And in that gaze, something passed between them. Not accusation, not even sorrow, just truth. Over tea, they didn't speak about Taylor. They spoke about the weather, the garden, the book Andrew had just finished. Small things, gentle things. Margaret let him come to her on his own terms, and eventually, he did. "I didn't see it," he said one evening, as dusk draped itself over the porch. "How far I let myself drift. How you were edited out." Margaret nodded, not with bitterness, but with quiet affirmation. "It happens slowly," she said. "Until one day, you realize you're only showing up where you're still wanted." He looked at her, eyes full of something he hadn't offered in years' honesty. "I let her set the tone. I didn't protect you. I'm sorry. It wasn't grand, it wasn't rehearsed, but it was real." And it opened a door. Not long after, Andrew introduced Margaret to someone new. Her name was Emily. She didn't arrive with flash or fanfare. She didn't wear curated charm or quote wedding hashtags. She came with a basket of lemon muffins and a soft voice. She asked Margaret about her garden, about the books on her shelf, about her favorite memory of Andrew as a child. But most of all, she listened. Really listened. And when Andrew mentioned his mother used to plan weddings, Emily's eyes lit up not with envy, but admiration. "I'd love to hear your stories," she said. "You must have seen so many beautiful beginnings." That was the moment Margaret knew she was no longer being tolerated. She was being seen, not as a relic, but as a root. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the soil of connection soften ready again for something new to grow. It started with a cup of tea on the porch and a sentence so simple, yet so healing. "Margaret, if Andrew and I get married, I'd be honored if you would help us plan it." Emily didn't say it out of guilt. She didn't say it as an apology for what had come before. She said it because she meant it genuinely, warmly, without performance. And in that moment, Margaret felt something shift. Not a grand redemption, not a sweeping declaration, but an invitation. This time, there were no speeches about staying in her lane. No careful avoidance, no tight-lipped politeness. Emily didn't just welcome Margaret's presence, she valued her perspective. She asked questions, took notes, laughed at the old stories, and marveled at the way Margaret's mind still remembered which flowers bloomed best at sunset weddings and how music should rise just as the couple walks down the aisle. The planning was quiet, joyful, real. There were no influencers, no vibes, no curated illusions. Instead, there was Emily honest, open, standing in Margaret's kitchen barefoot, flipping through swatch books and sipping mint tea. And there was Andrew, this time attentive and grounded, listening to the women in his life talk about centerpieces and ceremony scripts with equal respect. The venue they chose wasn't grand, it was a garden tucked behind a library where the scent of lavender drifted through the air and sunlight filtered through maple leaves. It wasn't Instagram perfect, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect enough. Margaret didn't lead the planning. She didn't take over. She didn't need to. She was simply there, included, appreciated. And with every small detail linen folded just so, candles lit with care, a handwritten welcome card for each guest, Margaret stitched love into the fabric of their day, not to prove herself, but because it brought her joy again. The wedding came on a crisp fall afternoon, nothing extravagant, no spotlight. Just laughter, the rustle of leaves, and two people who had learned from the past and chose to begin again, this time with clarity. When Margaret handed Emily her bouquet moments before she walked down the aisle, Emily held her hand and whispered, "This whole day has your fingerprints. Thank you for everything." Margaret smiled, not as a woman who was finally seen, but as someone who had never needed the spotlight to begin with. She had always been enough. Now, she was simply being loved accordingly. Margaret no longer lived her life waiting to be needed. She didn't pace near the phone or scroll through old messages hoping to feel remembered. That longing had softened like the edges of a well-worn photograph, still cherished, but no longer painful to hold. Instead, she poured herself into mornings that began with soft light and the scent of rosemary from her windowsill garden, into walks without destinations, into books that had sat unread for too long, into writing stories that had waited decades to be told not for applause, but for truth. She didn't volunteer to stay busy. She didn't keep herself occupied to mask the silence. She simply lived, fully, gently, on her own terms. And from that place quiet, steady, whole something unexpected began to happen. Andrew started calling more often, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. He asked about her garden, her writing, the new recipe she was trying for peach scones. He began showing up not just in person, but with presence. Not because Margaret tried harder, or because she demanded it, but because in stepping back, she had made space for him to come forward. Their bond no longer felt like a lifeline stretched too thin. It felt like a slow walk side by side, rediscovering a rhythm that didn't rush, that didn't reach back in regret. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old drawer, Margaret found a ribbon from Andrew's first birthday, faded and delicate. She didn't cry, she smiled, not with sadness but with quiet pride. She had raised a son, she had given her best. And now, as he stood as a man more aware, more human, she could meet him eye to eye, not as someone waiting for acknowledgement, but as someone who had already acknowledged herself. That, she realized, was the gift. Not the wedding, not the apology, not the return of gratitude, but the gentle knowing that she had reclaimed herself. And in doing so, she had become the kind of woman whose strength needed no explanation. Margaret had once been told to stay in her lane, and she did. But in staying in her lane, she found it wasn't a narrow shoulder along someone else's road. It was a path of her own, winding, quiet, resilient, and it led her home.